Now let's hear from Jim Cantrell, CEO of Phantom Space. This is a company that wants to put satellites into space at half the cost of Elon Musk's SpaceX. In fact, Jim was the first business development guy at SpaceX 20-some years ago. Thanks for being with us, Jim. We want to ask you about the China balloon stuff lately and the broader topic of, space, the final military frontier. So first, tell me, you've been involved in 46 satellite launches, and you've worked for various government enterprises, NASA. You've advised the Russians. So the China balloon fiasco, have you ever seen anything like it before, Jim Cantrell? And what do you make of it?
Well, we've never seen a Chinese balloon come over the U.S. Historically, the U.S. used to do this to Russia, the Soviet Union, and it caused a lot of problems in the 50s. And then we came up with the U-2, and Gary Powers got shot down flying over Soviet nuclear test sites, and in fact, over Baikonur, where they launched all their rockets. And so there's a long history of doing this, but this aspect of the Chinese doing it so brazenly, where everybody can see it over the U.S., is new. And the altitudes which they're doing it from is also new, because normally you have to fly these things at 120,000 feet. And this one was flying at 60,000. Your airliners typically are at 40. So this was down close to the airliners. This was a bit unusual in that sense.
Now, do you know whether because it started out, we had James Arity on last week. He's a Wall Street Journal reporter, was based in China for a long time. And the origins of the China balloon program were science, trying to find cosmic particles up on the edge of space there. And now the military has become more and more involved, it looks like. Do you know if our military is on par with China regarding balloons and balloon spying?
So, yes, I live here in Tucson, Arizona, and not very far from here is Fort Huachuca, which is where all the UAVs are based out of. There's also an aerostat division down there where you can see them floating over, monitoring the border with Mexico. So we've been using this technology for a long time. It's a bit different than what the Chinese are using. They have something that looks like it's a bit of a copy of one of our commercial companies' worldview. But yeah, the U.S. has been using lighter than air vehicles, as we call them, for quite some time here.
Now, these balloons, by hovering at that 60,000 feet, they can stay in kind of one place for a long time and monitor and inspect. How big of a threat do you think this is? James Arity of the Journal talked about how they've tested mock missiles, kind of dumping out of the balloons and seeing how they do it, getting back into the atmosphere and heading someplace.
Yeah, there are actually some commercial companies out there that want to launch rockets into space off of balloons. It turns out to be a very difficult thing to do. You would think a plastic bag full of helium would be a simple device. It's actually very complicated to operate from. So that being said, all these things are possible, right? There's all sorts of things besides, surveillance technologies that could be in that balloon. I personally worry about EMP devices of the non-nuclear type up there, but flying at 60,000 feet is really the equivalent of them putting an aircraft in our airspace and sort of, waving their fingers at us, and because it's very much in an altitude range where some of our aircraft do fly.
Now, talk about how, first, it turns out we learned later from CBS News that the U.S. military was aware of this China spy balloon as it left from the southern coast of China. They watched it as it headed over Alaska and into Canada. Then they sit on their hands at the military's advice while it goes over the entire continental U.S. And then in the next week or so, they shoot down 3 different balloons, including they might have used a $440,000 Sidewinder missile, or 2 of them, to shoot down it turns out a $12 hobbyist balloon. How are we looking there to the rest of the world?
We look a little stupid and panicked, but what I think is going on in reality is, having been on the inside of these things, a lot of times we don't want to acknowledge that we know something's there, because that acknowledges our means of detecting it, which is an important thing to protect. So you can understand why sometimes they watch spies do damage in terms of watching who else they reveal within, say, agencies in the U.S. Same thing here, I think, is going on. I don't know, because I'm no longer involved, but it looks to me like once this thing was flying over Montana slowly and people started taking pictures of it, there was this very interesting public reaction where people were starting to panic. And, it doesn't matter if you say, well, look, Chinese satellites are flying over us all the time. and taking images of what we're doing, probably even better than whatever this thing was doing. But this really unnerved the public. And I thought it was very interesting to see that, because the satellites, out of sight, out of mind, but this balloon was there, and it was reminding everybody that Big Brother's watching you. This Big Brother was Chinese.
Watching, but I saw speculation on Twitter, because Twitter is the whip end of worries and fear, because that marks engagement, and so the algorithms are set that way. But people wonder what is inside the balloon. Is there a toxic substance that's meant to explode and spread? And they wonder if it was armed with some type of laser weapon. And later imagery showed Jim Cantrell of Phantom Space showed, I believe it was kind of a big camera attached up to that thing, and it was looking all over and flashing and taking images like crazy.
Sure, I'm sure that's what it was. And the interesting part for me personally was their ability to fly at 60,000 feet, because there's steering winds there that if you can vary your altitude, you can use those steering winds to go where you want. You can't just take a balloon up there and make it fly around like an airplane. But this is a very unusual technology that I was actually part of the group that invented it at Worldview Enterprises here in Tucson. So I believe that technology was stolen by the Chinese from Worldview.
That's really interesting. Well, we have yet to see, despite the rise of the China economy to number 2 in the world, we truly have yet to see it innovate a whole lot versus riffing off of what technology they borrowed or stole from U.S. companies. Get back a minute, if you would, Jim, to the EMP threat, this electromagnetic pulse. It comes out, it does something, and it could shut down the electricity grid. I saw a speech a few years ago from a former defense guy, and it was truly chilling, talking about how basically 1/3 of the country could die within 18 months if the electrical grid shuts down.
Sure. Yeah, so EMP was really discovered back in 1962 with the Starfish nuclear tests, which were done off of an atoll not far from Hawaii. And what they did was they shot a nuclear weapon up into space and set it off. And this created a pulse of magnetism that when it interacted with the power grid in Hawaii, it completely knocked out the power grid on most of the Hawaiian Islands. And this was, before that, rather an unobserved phenomenon because nobody had really exploded a nuclear weapon that high in space. So that's been the primary worry, is something like that that the North Koreans could do, or terrorists, or Chinese or Russians. So the non-nuclear EMP threat, a lot of that stuff is very classified and we can't talk about it, but let's just acknowledge that it exists. So you could have a rather localized EMP effect. If you watched some of the popular Hollywood movies, that they talk about this as a way to shut down Las Vegas, for example, in one movie. So those possibilities are out there, but it would be a localized effect.
A localized effect. Now, at the time of this speech from this defense guy or CIA guy, I think it was from the Clinton administration days, he said it would take only about $10 billion to bulletproof our electrical grid against this type of a threat. And so would have a shield installed. Do you know anything about technology that can fix this and the chances for getting anyone to spend on that?
I think that's, if you don't mind me saying, bullcrap. We worry about how we protect our electronics, and they're very vulnerable. So there's a whole group of survivalist type people who are becoming expert at this, and the military is already an expert about how you prevent vehicles, for example, from being made non-operable from an EMP. And it's not that simple. So particularly when you have processor-based electronics, like in your phones, computers, those things are extraordinarily sensitive to this sort of thing. So I call BS on that.
Huh. Do you think we should be doing some work toward that, perhaps?
Well, of course, and I believe we are. But this is also point counterpoint. It could very well be a way for us using offensive means against other countries. I know during the first Gulf War, we shut down the entire electrical grid in Iraq with not an EMP, but we had a bomb that would explode over their substations that had a lot of carbon fiber that would go out and short off all the exposed lines and so forth.
To do that, yeah. Now, have any ideas on how we combat this China balloon thing? Do we just have to let it happen? If we can't get jets up there high enough to shoot them down, what do we do? Can we make our own balloons to go after them?
Yeah, the first one was shot down with an AIM-9X made by Raytheon locally here. I know some of the people that were involved in that program, and you're right, they're very expensive. When I was in France for the French Space Agency, we had a balloon that we were doing that went rogue over Paris, and they tried to shoot it with bullets. It won't come down with bullets. So there's really not an easy way to knock these things down, which is kind of interesting. Eventually they'll come down, if you fill them full of bullet holes, but it's not like the AIM-9X that just took it out really, really fast.
The AIM-9X, the Sidewinder missile, that is, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the Sidewinders used on the toy balloons.
Yeah. You're going with the old military phrase instead of the popular press Sidewinder. I see, but I like the Sidewinder name better, my friend. Well, one thing we learned last week from this Wall Street Journal guy, oh my gosh, these balloons the U.S. NASA agency puts up, one of them could hold the Yankee Stadium. It's so massive, which is just amazing. Now the military must be in on that, right? NASA insists that our military is not involved at all, but our military's got to be doing something on this, and it would be almost negligent of them not to.
Correct. Yeah, there are two separate balloon programs in the United States. There's the NASA one that primarily operates out of Palestine, Texas, and then the military one primarily operates out of southern New Mexico, out of White Sands, New Mexico. So not as well known, but they use it for developing target boards for flight systems tests and other scientific kinds of things. But the NASA program is far more active than the DoD balloon program. There's this aerostat or lighter than vehicle program, which is operational. They use quite a bit in Iraq and Afghanistan to watch for threats and moving Taliban and things like that. So just like they watch the border here. So it's very active, right? But in terms of experimental, like NASA with these huge balloons, that's mainly still almost scientific in nature out of Holloman. Yeah.
I see. And well, that's kind of interesting. That's some good stuff. Jim Cantrell of Phantom Space, a space veteran, one of the early business development guys at the old SpaceX, and a veteran of quite a few startups. Now let's go a little broader, if we would, to space as the final military frontier, because I know you might have some thoughts on this. And let's remember, guys, that Jim Cantrell here, he's worked at 10 different space startups. He was at the NASA Jet Propulsion Lab. He was advising on U.S.-Russia defense projects. U.S.-Russia, can you believe that? And the French Space Agency. And also, I should mention Jim Cantrell here is an avid road racer. He's raced many times in the 25 hours at Thunderhill and the 24 hours of Daytona Classic, which means this man loves speed. So Jim Cantrell is also an author, and he's written novels, which I really resent and envy. What do you think about space as the next or the final military frontier? How far along are we, and how's the U.S. doing compared with China?
Space is what we call an asymmetric capability that has allowed the United States to win some of the most recent wars, in particular in Iraq, in the first Iraq war. We use space assets in a way that nobody had ever seen before, and it gave us an asymmetric advantage that just crushed this multi-million man army, and did it in just a few weeks
because of surveillance rather than weaponry.
Both, right? So space guides the weaponry. It also gives us a surveillance capability, and there are a lot of other communications capabilities that just come from our domain in space that are extremely, extremely important. And our adversaries understand this, and they don't have this kind of equivalency. And we've been masters at it for 30 years, ever since Apollo. We even had what was called the Manned Orbiting Laboratory, which was to follow Apollo, which you'd send a bunch of astronauts up there with uniforms on to observe the Earth. And then people don't know that a lot of the shuttle missions were classified and were run completely by the National Reconnaissance Office. So there are a classified astronaut corps out there that have flown. I know many of those guys. So,
guys who go into space to conduct surveillance, and we don't know their names, and we don't know that they've taken trips into space. They aren't astronaut heroes. They are instead astronaut unknowns. We call them. They're undercover astronauts. We don't even know they're up there.
They're quiet heroes, right? They just don't go out and make themselves known to the public.
That is the best kind, Jim.
Yes, exactly.
Quiet heroes.
Exactly.
I like that.
Yeah.
Well, all right. So that's the past, and so we've been able to do this since the 90s, and yet aren't the Chinese putting killer satellites in space capable of taking out other satellites.
Right. So at the risk of sounding like everybody else, the United States has had an operational ASAT capability since the 70s, and so did the Soviets. So the idea
ASAT stands for
anti-satellite. So the idea is you launch a rocket from the surface of the Earth and it intercepts a foreign satellite and blows it to smithereens. Now, the problem with that is it creates a lot of debris. So the testing of that's fairly limited. But to date, the Chinese did it. They did it January 11th, 2007, and created a huge debris cloud. Then the Indians followed suit later, about 4 or 5 years ago, and did the same sort of thing. And so the question then becomes is, how do you prevent somebody from attacking your space assets? And the answer really is you put a lot of small stuff up there, which makes it impractical. It's kind of like this balloon problem. Why put an expensive asset like an ASAT missile against a cheap small satellite when it's maybe $10 million to $100,000 when they can just replace it quickly? So to avoid these future conflicts in space is going to be all about deterrence, and that deterrence comes in the form of like Starlink. The Russians threatened to take out Starlink, if you remember the news.
Yes.
They also threatened to take out the ICEYE radar constellation. ICEYE might have been easier because it's 7 satellites, but they're still $5 million satellites. And the Russians ultimately decided not to because the calculus was wrong. The strategic calculus for taking something like that out would be a very costly event because the entire world would be pissed off at that. Not only the U.S., but everybody else that has to use space.
Although Russia's shown it doesn't care a whole lot, given its unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. But Jim Cantrell, are you saying that the answer lies in, instead of putting up big birds that are great targets for taking it out, you put up dozens or hundreds of small little satellite cubes? I believe that your Phantom Space is part of a NASA program. I did a little consulting to your company. I guess I should say that at this point, since I'm mentioning, but where you're putting up you've got some contract to launch these onto like 2 feet or 3 feet cubes or something that are fully capable satellites. Tell us about that.
Yeah, they're the size of a toaster oven, and they're able to image the Earth with as much resolution as our old KH-11 spy satellites used to do, even though that data is still classified.
At a fraction of the cost, I'm sure.
At single-digit millions of dollars instead of single-digit billions of dollars. So it's a revolution that's going on in space, and because you can bring that cost down, you can put a lot more of them up, so it becomes resilient to attack. And that is the answer, and that's why now over half of all the mass that's put into space, not just the number of satellites, but the mass that's put into space, is under 1,000-pound satellites. So they're the size of your printer, the size of a small refrigerator, whereas they used to be bus size or car size.
Right. And we're hearing some of the big incumbent companies like McDonnell Douglas, and I'm not sure if they specifically are doing that, but I mean, big contractor companies beginning to raise concerns about junk in space. It's filling up. There's too much. But doesn't it turn out that space is pretty big? Is this a made-up problem? One
man's satellite's another man's junk, right? And so yes, it's all about where you place it. There are certain orbits where these big, expensive satellites, the bigger they are, the more expensive they tend to be, where they go because they want to be up there for a long time. The Earth's atmosphere actually cleanses orbit. So if you're too close, your satellite will re-enter and burn up in the atmosphere within weeks, months, maybe years. But if you go up to some of these other higher orbits, you're up there for 100 years. So the problem is if you put debris in those orbits, it doesn't clean itself out. Over time, it spreads out, which is also bad. But what you want is things down close to the Earth so that after 5-10 years, the Earth naturally cleans it out.
Okay, that sounds like a good place to stop this conversation. Jim Cantrell of Phantom Space and a super space ranger. Thanks so much for being here on What's Bugging Me, man. I enjoyed it. I hope you'll come back.
Yeah, anytime, Dennis.
Have a wonderful day, sir.
You too.
Take care.
Bye-bye.